Matan Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, the increase in gun violence in Montreal in recent years is part of a new phenomenon, according to experts. Gang members are now firing multiple shots at buildings and cars to send a message and mark what they claim to be their territory. The guns they're using aren't covered by Bill C21. Does the minister admit that the solution to this terrible problem isn't to make some guns illegal when they already should have been, as C21 does? The solution lies elsewhere. It's to keep illegal guns out of our neighborhoods. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, I fully agree with my colleague. The cycle of violence involving guns is at such a point, at such a height, and we've already taken action on assault weapons, and we're going to continue with the next steps. But the question now is C21. We have to stop delaying and obstructing. The Conservatives have to stop that. The debate has to begin on C21 to protect our communities, and I'm always open to working together with the Bloc on this. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, the question wasn't about C21. Like my colleague said, gunshots in the streets of Montreal don't always kill, but they're still a victim, the public sense of security. This gun culture that's taking hold in Montreal is also a gang culture. So to solve the problem, the police need help dealing with the gang situation. C21 isn't a bad bill, Mr. Speaker, but it doesn't provide any solution to this problem. When will the minister see that one of the problems to this problem is to create a list of criminal organizations so that we can address the gang problem? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, our government has already taken a lot of concrete steps. For example, a $350 million fund for police services, but with all due respect, C21 does take concrete steps to target organized crime. For example, increased penalties and new surveillance authorities to prevent gun violence, and we will work together with the Bloc and all members to pass this bill. It's very important. It's key to protecting our communities. Thank you very much. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Good morning. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. A 12-year-old girl just walking down the street found herself caught up in the middle of a shooting in Montreal, and she was traumatized. This is happening on our streets in Quebec, Mr. Speaker. Instead of tackling the problem of street gangs and illegal gun trafficking, this government, with Bill C5, is doing just the opposite. They're removing mandatory prison sentences for crimes involving firearms. How can this government be so out of touch as to do the exact opposite of what is so obviously needed and common sense? The Honourable Minister of Justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Serious offences are still being punished seriously. The situation my colleague just described is not a situation that's covered by C5. Bill C5 covers situations that are not a danger to public safety, that are not a threat to the community's sense of safety. Bill C5 targets overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in the justice system. That's precisely what we're accomplishing with that. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Well, here on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we believe serious and violent gun crimes warrant hard time. We stand with the victims. It's sad to see this government openly siding with the criminals. It even lets them serve their sentences under house arrest for robbery or extortion with a firearm. Those are quite serious crimes, Mr. Speaker. Why is this government so soft on crime with C5? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's something else to see this government once again trying to defend a completely failed policy of Stephen Harper, the tough-on-crime approach. Mr. Speaker, what we're doing, we're still punishing very serious offenses in a very serious way. But what we're currently doing is when public safety is not threatened, when there's no danger, no threat to public safety, we're doing things differently to better support communities and victims. The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, here's what Stephen Fogang, a member of Montreal's Black community, had to say about Bill C5. He said, when the government contemplates getting rid of some of the minimum sentences in the criminal code, we can only wonder whether they're more interested in protecting criminals than the public and victims of crime. Would the Prime Minister be willing to meet with Mr. Fogang and members of other communities to get the facts instead of protecting the criminals? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Harper's tough on crime approach was a total failure. Our jails have simply been filled up with Black and Indigenous people. It didn't work. So mandatory minimum sentences were part of the problem, and they were causing delays in the court system all around the world, Mr. Speaker, and especially in the U.S., which Harper was basically copying. They are all getting rid of minimum sentences, mandatory minimums there, because they realize they don't work. So we're acting to better protect society. The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indigenous peoples and First Nations organizations have long called for reforms to policing. These communities deserve policing services that don't exacerbate systemic racism. It's time for Indigenous policing to be seen as essential. Indigenous groups have been very clear that they want legislation that recognizes and funds First Nations policing as a priority. Mr. Speaker, what is this government doing to support culturally sensitive First Nations policing and to recognize its essential role on the road to reconciliation? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd like to thank my colleague for her hard work.
Funded culturally sensitive Indigenous police services is a top priority and vital to our commitment to walk the pathway to truth and reconciliation. We understand the importance of recognizing Indigenous police services as an essential service, which is why our government is launching a public engagement process imminently to develop legislation. In consultation with Indigenous groups, provinces and territories, we'll work to further protect Indigenous communities all across Canada. Mr. Speaker, we will do this work because it is in response to the calls to justice, the calls to action, and because it is the right thing to do. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Brentford-Brent.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians from coast to coast are worried about the rising rate of violent gun crimes in their communities, and they are calling on this government for action. But instead of listening to Canadians, the Liberals are removing mandatory jail time for offences like robbery with a firearm, extortion with a firearm, and weapons trafficking, just to name a few. Canadians don't want to see government bills that help dangerous criminals skip out on jail time. They want dangerous criminals taken off our streets. Will the Liberals reverse course on their soft on crime agenda?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, serious crime in this country will always carry with it serious consequences. The kinds of situations that we are targeting with this legislation on minimum mandatory penalties, Mr. Speaker, are situations where public security, public safety is not at risk, Mr. Speaker. It is being done to attack the systemic overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. The kinds of situations he is describing are being attacked in Bill C21, and we're raising the maximum penalties.
Honourable Member for Fundy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, that is incomprehensible. Canadians simply don't buy this Liberal logic. According to Liberal logic, the Justice Minister's bill tackles racism by decreasing jail time for gun crimes. But the Public Safety Minister's bill tackles racism for increasing jail time for the exact same crimes. They can't have it both ways, so which one is it?
The Honourable Minister. I believe they were very excited to have two people trying to speak, so we'll just calm down and we'll only let one go. The Honourable Minister of Justice from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, this attack on minimum mandatory penalties coming from a lawyer is something that's hard to understand. The situations that he describes are not the situations that would be touched by minimum mandatory penalties. Mr. Speaker, minimum mandatory penalties are being abandoned because they fail. It's a failed so-called tough-on-crime policy. The jurisdictions in the United States that inspired the Harper government to bring in these minimum mandatory penalties are abandoning minimum mandatory penalties one by one. Serious crime will always be punished seriously, Mr. Speaker. There's no threat to...
The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River, Brentford Brent.
Mr. Speaker, the 83-year-old father of my constituent was deported from Canada because of this government's draconian mandates. He arrived in Canada, and despite being doubly vaccinated, one of the vaccines he had was not approved. He cooperated and got the Pfizer shot. That didn't help. After being held 3 days, he was sent back to Venezuela to return after a 2-week quarantine. Unnecessary stress, extra expenses, zero common sense. Will the minister apologize for the appalling treatment of this family?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Back in 2020, the Conservatives claimed that we wouldn't have enough vaccines for all Canadians, but let me be clear. Canada has sufficient supply to ensure that all eligible Canadians are protected for primary series, boosters, and pediatrics. On this side of the House, our government will continue to make sure that we're putting the health and safety of Canadians first, because nobody wants another wave of this COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite raised a particular case. If you'd like to discuss it personally, I'd be happy to accept a call or an email anytime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.